Herzlich willkommen zur Sternstunde Philosophie. Stellen Sie sich vor, Sie lebten in Sicherheit und Wohlstand. Sie könnten tun und lassen, was Sie wollen, brauchten keiner Arbeit nachzugehen. Einzige Bedingung, Sie dürften den Herrn oder die Herrin, die das alles bezahlt, nicht verlassen, nicht enttäuschen, nicht brüskieren. Wären Sie dann wirklich frei? Auf keinen Fall, meint mein heutiger Gast Philip Pettit, einer der einflussreichsten Philosophen unserer Zeit. Denn frei zu sein heißt für ihn in erster Linie von niemandem beherrscht zu werden. Was sich verändert unter uns Menschen und in der Politik, wenn wir so über Freiheit nachdenken, darüber reden wir jetzt. Herzlich willkommen, Philip Pettit.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Ja, bevor wir über Freiheit sprechen, müssen wir noch kurz über Albert Einstein sprechen. Sie sind nämlich hier in Bern, weil Sie hier die Einstein Lectures halten, eine Vorlesungsreihe an der Universität, bei der jeweils Themen aus Physik, Mathematik oder Philosophie aufgenommen werden, zu Ehren von Albert Einstein, der über 10 Jahre hier in dieser Stadt gelebt hat. Sie sagen ja, Einstein sei nicht nur ein großartiger Mathematiker gewesen, sondern auch eine Art Philosoph.
Well, yes, I mean, he's a philosopher in many different ways, isn't he? I mean, I think a lot of Einstein's original work was influenced in good part by philosophy, by Ernst Mach, for example. And his idea of the thought experiment, you know, of, for example, imagining how a clock would seem if you're standing on a railway station and the train is moving away from you at a very high speed, given that the speed of light remains constant. And it was really as a result of that thought experiment, Gedankenexperiment in German, that he really latched on to probably the most exciting, transformative idea, really, of physics in the last 100 years. Even more transformative, I think, than his later theory of general relativity. The idea that time is actually something that's relative to position and relative to the speed at which you're traveling. That's already philosophical.
Und diese Idee, dass sogar Zeitreisen möglich sein sollten, ich denke, das käme Ihnen eigentlich sehr entgegen. Denn Sie haben 2 Professuren, die eine in Princeton in den USA, die andere in Canberra in Australien. Ich meine, das stelle ich mir relativ aufwendig vor.
It would not be so demanding if I could travel at the speed of light. But unfortunately, even the best airplanes don't reach that speed, obviously.
Und wie organisieren Sie das praktisch?
Well, I spend basically a semester teaching in each of those universities, at Princeton University in America and the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia.
Nun, das sind 2 der wohl wichtigsten Institute weltweit. Gerade Princeton ist natürlich ein weltbekanntes akademisches Forschungszentrum. Sie wohnen ungefähr 100 Meter entfernt von da, wo Albert Einstein auch gelebt hat. Wie ist das, wenn man es als Philosoph so weit gebracht hat? Lastet auch eine gewisse Verantwortung auf einem?
Well, I feel the burden of responsibility in giving the Einstein lectures. It's obviously a great honor, and I was very surprised and very pleased to be asked to give them. Whether my lectures lived up to the Einsteinian sort of standard is another question. I fear they obviously didn't. Who could do anything that matches Einstein after all?
Aber trotzdem, wenn man so viel erreicht hat in der Philosophie, gibt es so etwas wie intellektuelle Verantwortung für Sie?
Well, I think that there is a responsibility that people in intellectual life, like in philosophy, have, which is to relate what they do to the public world and to, you know, the life that the rest of us lead. My own view of philosophy is that you can't leave it in the office. You bring it home with you. I think philosophy is not worthwhile unless it's actually transforming your own understanding and experience. And when your philosophy reaches into issues of public policy, I think it's important that you at least work as far as you can at giving them a public airing, giving them a public presence.
Das ist ein bisschen die Idee von Kierkegaard, die er auch vertreten hat, der sich einmal lustig gemacht hat über die Philosophen, die ein Gedankenschloss bauen und dann selber in der Scheune wohnen. Das ist im Grunde genommen das, was Sie sagen.
That's exactly what I'm saying. In fact, in something I wrote on this theme some years ago, if I remember, I cited Kierkegaard as being exactly the sort of model that you ought not to live in a barn, so to speak, and construct a castle in thought. It's not worth constructing, I think, your philosophical thoughts unless they have some connection with personal experience. I mean, it may be totally personal, and also with, insofar as you're doing that sort of philosophy, ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of law, that it connects with social life, with the public world.
Nun ist ja interessant, Sie haben es, wie ich schon gesagt habe, sehr weit gebracht in der Philosophie. Der ursprüngliche Plan war aber ein anderer. Sie traten nämlich ein ins Priesterseminar, um katholischer Priester zu werden. War das damals eigentlich Ihr Wunsch oder der Ihrer Umgebung oder Ihrer Eltern?
Oh, it was definitely my wish at 17. I had actually wanted to become a doctor. That was the sort of family ambition. I had uncles who were doctors and so on. But at 17, shortly before finishing secondary school, I became seized with the ideal of being a priest, and so I gave up the medical ambitions and I went simultaneously to university, Maynooth College in Ireland, and to a university, the National University of Ireland. The one campus was both a campus of a seminary and of a university. So I did my university courses at the same time as living in a seminary.
Und dann ist etwas geschehen. Sie haben sich nämlich in Sartres Schriften verliebt. So sagen Sie es zumindest im Nachhinein. Jean-Paul Sartre, wir sehen ihn hier mit Simone de Beauvoir im Frühling 1946 in Genf. Er notierte sich in diesen Tagen: alles mahnt uns hier an die Tradition des freien Denkens und der freien Aussprache. Jean-Paul Sartre, also auch ein Denker der Freiheit wie Sie. Wieso war die Begegnung für Sie so intensiv, dass Sie sagen, dass Sie sich verliebt haben?
It's hard to explain, really. I mean, becoming a seminarian for me was, entering the priesthood was partly spurred, I think, by a sense of assuming there was a God, how important it was to understand our relationships with that God. Assuming we were free, as I thought we were, it was important to understand what free will was and what freedom was in relationship to religion, to God. And so I was prepared, as it were. The ground was laid, you might say, by my religious background for being excited by Sartre. Now, of course, Sartre, when I first began to read him, which was really in my second year at university, I found it so exciting because it was so different from anything I had been raised to think. So it really struck me, first of all, as something that was challenging for me. I was so keen, actually, on writing and reading Sartre that I'd had a classics education in Greek and Latin, and so I didn't have French. And I went to France that summer of my second year at university and seminary, so I spent 2 or 3 months in France working as a waiter with a charity organization in Paris for elderly people and for people whose spouses have been lost during the war and so on, usually the men, so they're mainly older women. And I learned French basically in that manner. And in order to read Sartre, yes, in the original. And there were various books about Sartre, which were in French only at that time, that I really wanted to read.
Jemand, der sehr früh Sartre übersetzt hat und die erste Monographie über Sartre geschrieben hat, ist die Philosophin Iris Murdoch. Eine Philosophin, die bereits gestorben ist und von der ich denke, man sollte sie eigentlich wieder entdecken. Man liest sie gar nicht mehr so häufig heute. Und sie sagt etwas Interessantes. Sie sagt, dass die Faszination für Sartre auch damit zu tun hätte, dass natürlich die ganze Dramatik der menschlichen Existenz schonungslos dargelegt wird, aber eben nicht nur in Theorie, sondern auch in Romanen, in Erzählungen, in Theaterstücken. Wir hören ihr ganz kurz zu.
I think existentialism may be something of a special case here because it is a rather literary philosophy. It emphasizes all sorts of things to do with the human predicament, and Sartre's marvelous philosophical work, L'Être et le Néant, is sort of full of pictures and conversations, as it were. It's true of Hegel, too, actually, that there's an awful lot of amusement and literary stuff, as it were, in both Hegel and in in Sartre, and this is interesting. This has something to do with the rather dramatic form of the thought in the philosophy itself, that there's some kind of drama which can be exhibited. There's some kind of feeling about the world which belongs both to the philosophy and to the novel.
Es gibt dieses Gefühl der Welt, von dem sie spricht.
Yes, I mean, I love Iris Murdoch both as a philosopher and as a novelist, I must say. And she is actually being read more and more these days. She's made a comeback within philosophical circles. I mean, she's never lost a centre place in literature, I would say. I think I was fascinated by something slightly different with Sartre from what Iris Murdoch talks about in that excerpt. Yes, the existential aspect, the involved aspect of his philosophy, of course, was gripping. But I think what struck me most was here was someone who had thought so comprehensively about everything. You know, he's a Titian, you know, to use a painting metaphor, in philosophy, not a Claude Lorrain, you know, not the small focusing on. And there's room for both painters and both sorts of philosophers. But what excited me about Sartre as a philosopher was the sweep, the range. So, for example, he had a view of the human subject, you know, as being literally without an inherent identity, because it was all up to what you actually chose for yourself in your life, in your decisions from the day to day. It was always there to be made. You were never fixed in a particular identity. You were, as he put it, a néant, a no thing, not a thing which has an identity. And then on the other side, his view was that almost everything inanimate, and indeed animate but non-human, I'm afraid that's not really one of his better sides, is really just stuff. It's like treacle, as he says in one metaphor. That's being, that is the thing. So he's got this wonderful dichotomy between the no thing that each of us is and the stuff or the thingness of reality out there. And he brings out both of these aspects of his vision in his literary work. So, for example, it's anxiety that is that we experience when we realize that we are a no thing, that we could be anything, that at any moment, for example, we could let ourselves die. And the hero of, you know, Arden in the Soul, some of those novels, is very much plagued by this anxiety. And on the other side, of course, the experience of inanimate nature or non-human nature is brought out in Nausea, where Roquentin, if I remember, the hero, experiences tables and chairs and trees as even without names, and experiences the distinctions he finds in reality as ones that he has constructed, of course, in tandem with his society. So you have this meaningless being, a l'être, and you have this no thing that we are, and you've got to find your way in this really absurd, meaningless universe by creating what you are to become. I found that a sort of riveting picture, and I found in particular the novels, the literature, the plays, you know, that trace that experience. And then on top of that, he was deeply involved politically. He had promised us a book on ethics, so he was going to give us an ethics based on this, and he was going to give us a politics, connecting with more left-wing Marxist traditions. I found that exciting too, although of course Sartre never did give us the ethics.
Es blieb beim Versprechen. Aber das ist interessant, weil einerseits würde ich sagen, Sie sind ja auch ein Denker der Freiheit und wir sprechen nachher gleich über Ihr Freiheitsverständnis. Das heißt, da gibt es eigentlich eine Parallele zu Sartre und gleichzeitig dieses breite Interesse an vielen Fragen der Philosophie, das kennzeichnet ja auch Sie. Ich glaube, es gibt kaum ein Thema, über das Sie nicht publiziert haben. Sie sind ein politischer Philosoph, Sie schreiben über Moralphilosophie, über Sprachphilosophie. Es gibt ganz viele Themen, die auch Sie interessieren, bis heute.
Excuse me. I guess that just comes from temperament. I mean, I took up philosophy because I was so excited at the thought that you could really think about what free will was, without any, so to speak, orthodoxy there that you had to defer to. I mean, that is really why I left the seminary and chose to, as it were, go my own way as I thought about it. And I was so excited at, the question of thinking about whether there is a God, confronting atheism, but also thinking about what it is about human society that makes us uniquely among species, really, capable of meeting the mind of another, capable of sharing an experience. I mean, obviously, various other mammals, certainly, other animals do share experiences, but I think not in the way we do. I mean, now I'm mouthing words, these are just sounds, they're being churned out by a speech center somewhere in my brain. But as I speak to you, I'm in control of that stream, so to speak, of words, and I construct myself and my experience through it. And you can enter into, hopefully at any rate, unless I'm being unintelligible, into what it is I'm trying to summon up. And equally, reciprocally, I can enter into yours. That I thought was so exciting and such a theme. I always, from the beginning, felt and this is non-Sartrean in a way, felt deeply that where Sartre was wrong was in de-emphasizing the social nature of human beings. It seems to me we are social animals and that is true at a depth that isn't really fully explored. In fact, the Einstein lectures are on that theme.
Genau, Sie lösen sozusagen das Individuum aus seiner Einsamkeit heraus in den sozialen Kontext hinein. Nun sind Sie durch die Liebe zur Philosophie ja eigentlich vom Priesteramtskandidaten abgefallen und haben sich, Gott sei Dank kann man sagen, ganz der Philosophie verschrieben, weil Sie sind ein großartiger Philosoph. Haben Sie auch den Glauben dabei verloren?
Yes, but slowly. I mean, I'm not I always think of myself as an agnostic, a skeptic. I mean, goodness knows, we really do not know what happened before the Big Bang, for example. We do not know whether or not there is some sort of reality encompassing the reality we experience or even study in science. So about that, I think I can say nothing, and I can form no beliefs, positive or negative. What I know, or what we all know, I think, is only what is within our reach in experience and in theory. And, we're really at the limits of thinking in both metaphysics, it seems to be, and scientific theory. And at that limit, we can't say, we can't know, for example, that there is a God. Of course, religious tradition has always held that in any case, making it a matter of faith and choice.
Und vermissen Sie manchmal diesen Glauben?
Yes, I do, in the sense that I think I miss in particular the experience of religious community. I think it's really quite a wonderful thing that people come together weekly or whatever and share, an acknowledgement of the limited place that we human beings occupy in the universe, and share in an appreciation of what there is that is good and great, but equally share in a sorrow over what is to be regretted and what is a matter of shame on us as a species. For example, I think that togetherness in emphasizing those themes is very important. I miss that, and I also miss, I must say, the joy of a choir, belonging to a choir. I loved Gregorian choice. Well, when I was in seminary, yes, I was in a choir. I mean, we basically learned all the traditional Gregorian chant, that attends the different religious ceremonies and so on, the Mass and various other ceremonies. And that is a truly wonderful experience, as anyone who has performed in a choir, or of course in any form of chorus, knows.
Diese Erfahrung im Priesterseminar, die hat Sie auch philosophisch nachhaltig geprägt, weil Sie im Nachhinein oft sagen, Sie haben da eigentlich auch erfahren, was es heißt, wirklich jemandem unterworfen zu sein. Also Herrschaft über das eigene Ich zu spüren, was auch einhergeht zum Beispiel mit Willkür, nicht zu verstehen, warum wird man jetzt genau bestraft, wer kriegt was, wer kriegt es nicht, aus welchen Gründen. Diese Form von Herrschaft, die hat Sie dazu gebracht, Freiheit neu zu denken. Und Ihre Idee ist wirklich, Bei der Freiheit geht es ganz zentral um diese Art und Weise, nicht beherrscht zu werden von nichts und niemandem.
Yes, I suppose, well, that really followed, I think the seminary experience did feed into some of my later thinking about freedom, but it didn't immediately occasion that way of thinking. Actually, it was later as I thought and indeed wrote about the social nature of human beings and came to the conclusion that it doesn't even make sense to imagine that we might live in a solitary existence, each of us separated from others. And as I've tried to work out that, one of the implications that that picture raises is, well, what is freedom then? Because the standard way nowadays of thinking about freedom is it just means being let alone, laissez-faire, being not interfered with. And of course, on that picture, if you lived alone in a state of nature, you'd have perfect freedom. And society, as it were, compromises freedom in that sense of non-interference. I started from the assumption that suppose we are essentially social. We can't even, it's not even logically coherent in a way to think about as living out of society. Then whatever freedom is, it's something that is at home in society, or it's not at home at all, it has no application. And thinking about that and what it would mean to be free in society with others, which is inescapable, it struck me forcibly that what it is to be free is to be able to operate on the same, on equal terms, as it were, with others. And then I became aware that this really connects with the long tradition of thinking, the Republican tradition of thinking, about which a friend of mine, Quentin Skinner in Cambridge, had actually written independently. So with his guidance, I read through that tradition very deeply, and so I began to connect this social notion of freedom, where you're not subject to the power of another, the discretionary will of another. You don't operate under their will, even should it be a gentle will. I began to connect that way of thinking with the Republican way of thinking, and it led me to a certain interpretation of the Republican tradition.
Über die sprechen wir nachher gleich, die politische Theorie, die sozusagen daraus folgt. Lassen Sie uns noch kurz bei dieser Idee, dieser Nichtbeherrschung bleiben. Sie benutzen dafür, ich muss hier kurz was hochholen, Sie benutzen dafür ein sehr schönes Bild, nämlich das Theaterstück von Henrik Ibsen, Nora oder das Puppenheim von 1897, wenn ich es richtig, 1879 im Kopf habe. Und in diesem Theaterstück, viele mögen es kennen, geht es um Nora. Sie ist verheiratet mit Thorwald und sie hat 3 Kinder. Sie ist schon lange in dieser Ehe und im Grunde genommen lebt sie in einem sehr netten Haushalt. Es ist alles gut bürgerlich, es ist gut gesorgt für sie, man hat alles, was man möchte. Sie isst sogar dazwischen Macarons, obwohl Thorwald ihr das eigentlich verbietet und er Macarons nicht mag. Sie genießt also eine gewisse Form von Freiheit, Luxus, Wohlstand, aber sie ist gemäß ihnen nicht frei, weil Thorwald hat eigentlich immer das letzte Wort. Und sie ist auch eine Frau, die irgendwann sagt, ich möchte nicht eine Puppe sein, ich möchte nicht wie in einem Puppenhaus leben.
Yes, I mean, I suppose I take certain liberties with Ibsen's A Doll's House. I knew the play, loved the play, and so on. And it does seem to me to, at least reconstructing the relationship at the beginning of that play, I think it gives a nice way of emphasizing and sharpening and making vivid the notion of freedom, where that means not living in the power of another, living under the will of another. So Nora really has the same range of, if you like, non-interference that anyone could wish for in that period of human history, in that country. That was Norway in the late 19th century. Thorvald allows her, basically, he gives her carte blanche. He allows her to dress as she wishes. He allows her to associate with whichever friends she chooses to associate. This is not very clear in the play. This is where I take some liberties with the play. He allows her to perhaps practice, go to whatever church she chooses to go to, and so on. I mean, she has everything she wants, as you might say, across the ordinary range of basic personal choices. But of course, what is the case is that under the law, as it is at the time, Torvald can actually put restrictions on Nora. In fact, he can put radical restrictions on. He has the power of dictating she shall not leave the house, she shall only meet with those he approves of, she shall only go to the church he approves of, she shall only wear the clothes that he wants her to wear. He has that power. He doesn't exercise it. So he is a master, but he's a gentle master because he gives her, in this sense, carte blanche. Now, I've asked this question actually giving lectures all over the world, really, from Ireland to China. I've asked sometimes quite large audiences. I remember one in China of about 200 or 300 students. I described this, and I say, now, is Nora free? After all, she's not interfered with in the really maximal range of choice you could expect. Is she free? And I remember so well the resounding sort of response of those students in China, which was, no, you know, they all chorus no. And that's the experience I find wherever you present that sort of image. Now, what's the lesson of that story? Well, the lesson is that even if you're not interfered with, because after all, Nora is not interfered with, as you mentioned, he doesn't want her to eat macaroons, but that's about all. But she can hide them in her skirts, so she gets away with that too. But the point is that even though she's not interfered with, enjoys a massive degree of freedom as non-interference, she is subject to the dominus, or the master. She's subject to dominatio, as the Romans called it, a relationship to a master, which means she lives under his will. Should his will change, then she's in trouble. So everything depends on his will remaining a good will. She depends on that in order to act as she wishes.
Und für Sie ganz zentral ist auch das, was Sie den Eyeball-Test nennen, also diesen Augapfeltest, muss man fast übersetzen. Also die Vorstellung, dass alle Menschen einander in die Augen blicken können sollen, ohne sich zu fürchten vor dem Gegenüber, aber auch ohne das Gegenüber irgendwie zu bewundern oder dankbar sein zu müssen. Also eben auch nicht ein guter Herrscher über sich zu haben, sondern überhaupt nicht beherrscht zu sein. Nun ist meine Frage aber, ist es manchmal nicht geradezu attraktiv für uns, beherrscht zu sein? Also ich meine, diese Freiheit muss man ja auch aushalten. Nora ist mutig. Nora verlässt die Familie. Aber ist es nicht für viele Menschen so, dass sie diese Freiheit gar nicht aushalten und gar nicht wollen, sondern lieber, keine Ahnung, Sugar Daddy-mäßig sich irgend in einen Arm werfen oder vielleicht auch nur den sozialen Medien anheimgeben, also einen Herr, eine Herrin akzeptieren und dafür mehr Wohlstand genießen?
Well, it's certainly true that we all know this of ourselves, that every one of us can be corrupted. We can be corrupted in the sense of losing our sense of an ideal that is almost built into our very nature as human beings. And I would say that if someone comes to cherish, so to speak, they're being dominated by another, then that's really a great denaturing. You know, it's of the person themselves. I mean, they have ceased to be what a human being can be. They've ceased to be their own person.
Das interessiert mich, weil ich denke, was Sie beschreiben, ist nicht, wie Menschen Freiheit genießen, sondern beschreiben eigentlich ein menschliches Ideal. Was Menschen sein sollen, was das Beste am Menschen ist und das Beste am Menschen wäre, nicht dominiert zu sein. Und die Figur, die mir immer einfällt, ist eigentlich Diogenes im Fass. Die antike Figur des Diogenes, der im Fass lebt, der sich einen Dolch schert um die Meinung der Leute, der masturbiert auf dem Marktplatz. Dann kommt Alexander der Große, fragt, was hättest du gerne von mir, von meinem großartigen Reichtum? Und er sagt nur, geh mir aus der Sonne. Also wäre doch eigentlich die Idee, der wahrhaft Freie ist der Bedürfnislose.
Well, I'm not sure that it requires the frugality of Diogenes, so to speak, to be free. I mean, that is a choice that presumably he made, and he's making that choice as a way of asserting, so to speak, that he had the power of doing so, that he wasn't dominated by others. But the ideal of freedom that I think is built into our nature, it's like a telos, you know, that we aim for. Because we all, even the word freedom for everybody represents an ideal. And what I want to do is identify the ideal that that word is best attached to. And I think we all know in our heart and souls that we're at our best when we're dealing with other people or another person on equal terms, meaning we're not fearful of what they'll do if we say the wrong thing. We're not fearful of what they'll do if we choose to take a certain line of action. We know that they will, so to speak, say, well, that's your choice. They will not have a power over us. And equally, if we're not, as it were, aware of their power to the extent to which we curry favor, we try to be sweet, we try to keep them sweet towards us. I think we all know that the ideal in a human relationship is one where in that way you stand on the same ground, you walk equally tall.
Das erinnert mich auch daran, dass Immanuel Kant ja diese Idee hat, dass es Pflichten gegen sich selbst gibt. Und man verletzt zum Beispiel diese Pflicht gegen sich selbst, wenn man Kriecherei begeht. Also sich einschleimen beim Gegenüber ist zum Beispiel auch etwas, wovon Kant denkt, wir verletzen unseren Selbstrespekt. Und das würde ja auch den Eyeball-Test, diesen Augenapfeltest, verletzen.
I think that Kant was actually deeply immersed himself in what I describe as the Republican tradition. Like in Republican Rome, it was well recognized that if you're a slave, even the slave of a totally benevolent, good-willed master, if you're in a position of Nora, as it were, in relation to Torvald, no matter how nice that master is, he may even, like Torvald, not wish to dominate, but can't help it because of the law. They recognized that that was unfreedom, that was dominatio, as they called it. Now, Kant is in that tradition of recognizing that you are unfree, if in that sense you can act as you wish in relevant areas, only if one or another person is willing for you to act as you wish. You're free only if you can act as you wish in those choices, regardless of what other people want you to do, and even regardless of what your preferences should be themselves. It's only then that you're free. Now, Kant himself actually draws out the lessons of this way of thinking about freedom in his very latest work, the Metaphysics of Morals, in particular the Discourse on Right, where he says that to be free externally, he means in relation to other people, is to enjoy independence, Unabhängigkeit, from the Willkür, from the power of choice of others. And that's exactly, as I came to recognize later in my own thinking, that's exactly the way I want to think about freedom. And I think that that tradition has thought about freedom. But unfortunately, we lost touch with that tradition, it seems to me, about 1800 in most of the Western world. And what I'd love to see is that image of freedom as non-domination being recovered and reworked within politics as well as in people's day-to-day lives.
Genau, und dann sprechen wir doch jetzt über die Politik, also dieser Republikanismus oder Neorepublikanismus, wie Sie das nennen, ist eigentlich die politische Theorie, die Sie verfolgen, eben ausgehend von Quentin Skinner, einem Philosophen, der da schon viel dazu gearbeitet hat. Und man muss vielleicht auch sagen, das hat jetzt nichts zu tun oder nur sehr wenig mit der US-amerikanischen republikanischen Politik, sondern es geht sozusagen zurück auf Cicero zum Beispiel, auf die antike Idee des Republikanismus, auf Machiavelli, dann natürlich Rousseau, ein großer republikanischer Denker, obwohl es da ganz viele Unterschiede gibt und Sie nicht alles genau gleich sehen, wie zum Beispiel Rousseau. Aber die eigentliche Idee ist auf jeden Fall Gewaltentrennung und eben kein Monarch über uns, kein Herrscher, sondern eigentlich das Volk, das die Regeln macht. Aber der Punkt ist ja, wenn wir gemeinsam zusammenleben wollen, dann muss ja jemand sagen, wo es lang geht. Und eine Idee, wie man das tun kann, ist mit einer Demokratie, einer Volksherrschaft. Das heißt, wir herrschen sozusagen über uns selbst. Das Volk gibt sich die Gesetze. Republikanisch gedacht Wäre denn so etwas wie der Brexit nicht möglich gewesen? Oder was würde denn eine republikanische Idee von Regierung bedeuten?
So the idea is, you mentioned the eyeball test. When it comes to private freedom, you might ask, well, how much protection do we have to have in the law? And how wide should this protection be? What should be the choices that we all enjoy protection in? And I suggest we all know the answer, but you can't quantify it. And the answer is, if you've got enough private protection across a sufficient number of choices to be able to look others in the eye without reason for fear or deference, then you really have it pretty good. Now, a similar test applies to when do we really control the lawmakers sufficiently to think that we are publicly free, that we're not publicly dominated? And the test there, I would say, is this. There are always going to be decisions by the public lawmakers, by government, by the state, that some people in the population are not going to like. They're not going to want them personally. Maybe it's a taxation that affects them. They're not going to approve of them. Maybe they think that those decisions are unjust in some way. But so long as each can think the following, that they need not feel resentment against this government because they share equally with others in control of what the government does, of the laws that it makes, and it was just tough luck that they were in the minority. Now, if the culture of the democracy is working sufficiently for people to think that, and that's a very high ideal. I mean, it's very hard to think of institutions that would really guarantee that. But if you really had a democratic rule of law under which we elected our governors, and when they were in place, we could contest them or challenge them, and there were independent authorities like the courts, for example, that could check them, and they could be called to book by ordinary people via the courts. If there was a rich array of institutions like that, a republican democracy, then ideally, but of course it is just an ideal, people might be very upset by certain laws, but they would not feel aggrieved or resentful. They would not feel, that's just because I'm in this corner of society, not in that.
Aber nimmt das generell nicht zu? Also um es vielleicht noch mal deutlich zu machen, Sie haben in vielen Texten sprechen Sie über die Ehe für alle, also die Zulassung zur Ehe für homosexuelle Paare und sagen, das wäre ein Grund, warum ich das Gefühl haben könnte, ich werde nicht gesehen, ich werde nicht gleich geachtet. Das heißt, da gibt es einen Grund, aufzubegehren und zu sagen, dieses Gesetz ist nicht gerecht, also sollte man es ändern. Nehmen wir nun aber die Corona-Regeln, also die Einschränkungen, die es beispielsweise in der Schweiz immer noch gibt. Viele Menschen gehen nach wie vor in der Schweiz auf die Straße und sagen, hier wird meine Freiheit zu Unrecht eingeschränkt. Das ist ja auch in vielen anderen europäischen Ländern der Fall, dass es Menschen gibt, die auf die Straße gehen und sagen, das ist wirklich eine Form von Beherrschung, von Herrschaft. Hier wird eingegriffen in unsere Freiheit.
That is often true. That freedom often is being limited, and people justly campaign, for example, against workplace, laws that make really employers masters of those they employ, as in America, where an employer can fire at will anyone who works for them in many places. So, of course, many of those challenges to government I'm going to back. However, it seems to me there is the populist movement, as is often called, or the neo-populist movement worldwide, seems to be nurtured by a mistake, a misconception of how we could control government. That misconception basically says there is only one way in which people control the lawmakers and those who impose the law, and that is by election. It's only if, given they can't do it together themselves, it's only if they elect someone and they say, basically, this person or this party speaks for the people, and whatever they do in the people's name, and they therefore give us, so to speak, public freedom. That is a bad mistake, it seems to me, because I think democracy needs at least 3 channels, not just election. It also needs capacity for people to contest what government is doing. The demonstration in the street is important, can be important, or in the media, you know, or in the courts, of course. And thirdly, the existence of other statutory officers like ombudsmen, election, you know, commissioners, who will make sure that those elected to government are actually operating properly.
Ich merke schon, es gibt keine einfache Antwort, sondern es geht darum, diesen Republikanismus wirklich zu leben und damit zurechtzukommen, dass es immer unterschiedliche Stimmen gibt, die man eben, gerade wenn es Minoritäten sind, auch irgendwie berücksichtigen muss. Man merkt an diesem Suchen ihrerseits auch, wie kompliziert Politik ist, wenn man es dann wirklich richtig machen will. Aber tatsächlich gab es einen Politiker, nicht nur einen, aber einen sehr prominent gewordenen Politiker, nämlich den spanischen Ministerpräsidenten Zapatero. Der hat 2004 ihre Bücher gelesen und gesagt, diesen Philosophen will ich, der soll mir helfen, mein Programm zu machen. Und er hat sie eingeladen, öffentlich über ihre Vision der Politik, der republikanischen Tradition zu sprechen. Sein Wahlkampfslogan war dann sogar No Dominación, also wirklich ihre Theorie eigentlich als Wahlkampfslogan. 2008 haben sie dann auch sein Programm evaluiert. Wie war das für Sie als Philosoph, dann plötzlich so eng mit einem Politiker zu tun zu haben?
It was a very strange experience. He actually read the book when it came in Spanish translation in 1999 and adopted it. Then I was told by his advisors he read a lot in political philosophy because he felt he wanted a philosophy to guide him. And happily, he endorsed republicanism in roughly the form that I had articulated in that book. And so over a number of years, friends in Spain would write and they would say, you know, you're being written about in the newspapers and so on because the leader of the opposition, and at that time no one thought he was going to be elected, is, you know, saying that he's standing with this sort of Republican approach. He was elected in 2004, and he then invited me at that point to give a lecture in Madrid on the approach. It was a public lecture. And just before I went out to speak, I was with him, and he was to respond. He asked me if I would like to be an advisor. And I said, well, I don't know how much a philosopher has to say to someone actively about policy in the day-to-day. But of course, I'd be happy to be an advisor in some sense, but don't expect too much. And then we went into the auditorium. I gave my lecture, but in response, in my lecture, I turned to him and I said, Prime Minister, or President as he is, but Prime Minister really, I said, you, for example, it's going to be very hard to live up to the Republican principles. I said, you, for example, have made the state, the national broadcaster, independent from you, so they can criticize you with impunity. You can't fire them. I said, you're going to find it very hard not to lift the phone, you know, to complain to the new head of the national broadcaster about what they've been saying about you. And he was very exercised by that. And so in his response, what he did was he invited me publicly to review his government for how far it had been faithful to Republican principles 6 months before the next election. I was actually relieved, as I said to him after the lecture, to say, I can't now be an advisor. I can't be a reviewer and an advisor. That would be to be judging my own case. And so I wasn't ever an advisor, in a way, happily, I think, for him as well as me, but I was a reviewer. And I think he was pretty extraordinary, actually, in his dedication to implementing principles.
Jetzt haben Sie ein Beispiel ja schon gebracht, nämlich die Pressefreiheit wirklich zu garantieren, sich nicht zu beklagen, wenn man schlechte Presse kriegt. Wenn Sie vielleicht noch etwas Konkretes nennen könnten, jetzt vielleicht gar nicht unbedingt auf Spanien bezogen, wenn Sie die verschiedenen Länder in Europa angucken oder auch in den USA, was würde sich ändern, wenn man wirklich Ihre Bücher umsetzen würde? Was wäre das Augenscheinlichste für uns alle, die in diesen Ländern leben? Was würde sich für uns Bürger und Bürgerinnen ändern, wenn wir in einer solchen Republik leben würden?
I think, for example, a range of things in employment relationships would change. Just to pick one example. So, for example, at the moment in the United States, and not to such an extent elsewhere, but to some extent elsewhere. There are three features of the employment relationship that are very troubling. One is the capacity to fire an employee at will. A second is that more and more employment relationships have got what they call non-compete clauses, which means clauses that say, if I voluntarily leave your employment, say in this industry, I commit to not seeking employment in that same industry for such and such a period. And a third is a clause that basically is sometimes called an arbitration clause that says, if there is any complaint I have about you as an employer or about the corporation involved, I agree to its being decided by arbitration. That means rather than going to the courts, that means that you block class action, which has been one remaining protection for employees in the United States. Now, I think once you get a workplace where employees are subject to those sorts of, you're my employer, let's suppose, Barbara, I'm your employee, and now I know you can fire me, you know, at will. You just don't like me. Maybe I'm doing a good job, but you know, heck, you got power. And besides, I can't leave voluntarily unless I go into another mode of work. And further than that, I can't even join with other employees in challenging what you and your corporation is doing in the way of workplace relationships, or maybe health relationships even within the... Now, in a word like that, I am going to have to live in fear and deference, basically, of you. I'm going to have good reason to try to keep you sweet, to curry favor, you know, to bend the knee, to tug the forelock, as they say in English, if you have a forelock. I'm going to have real reason to do that. And that means that in the Republican sense, you're a dominus and
Das
I
heißt,
am a subject.
In der Arbeitswelt gibt es diese Torvalds und man müsste die sozusagen auch staatlich kontrollieren oder einschränken, um die Freiheit der Menschen wirklich zu vergrößern. Lassen Sie uns zum Schluss des Gesprächs noch einmal zurückkommen auf uns Individuen und auf die kleinen Zusammenhänge, weil Sie auch so stark gesagt haben, Sie gehen nicht vom Individuum aus, wie das eigentlich der Liberalismus klassischerweise tut, sondern Sie gehen immer davon aus, dass wir eben nicht alleine sind, sondern in Gruppen leben. Und das ist ja auch interessant. Es gibt ein Buch von Ihnen, das heißt The Common Mind. Und Sie gehen ja so weit, dass Sie sagen, eigentlich könnten wir nicht einmal richtig denken, wenn wir nicht sprechen könnten. Also die Tatsache, dass wir in Austausch sein können, hat es erst mit sich gebracht, dass wir wirklich denken gelernt haben. Das heißt, Sie gehen sehr weit in der Idee, dass es das Individuum zwar gibt, aber dass es eigentlich sehr schwach ist, wenn es nicht an die Gruppe denkt.
We all agree, everyone agrees, that in the making of human beings, nature contributes a great deal, but equally culture contributes a great deal. But of course, theories differ in how much we get from nature, from our genes, from our DNA, and how much we get from our social life, our culture, what we're born into. What I want to argue is that actually we get a lot more from culture than even the more extreme, as it were, culturalists amongst us actually think. And I have a way of arguing that which is rather quaint, although, as I say, it's in the tradition, in the lectures I said, it's in the tradition of Einstein of going to a thought experiment and imagining creatures like us. I call them humanoids, who have most of our basic capacities, I mean, I list those and so on, but who don't yet have speech. And I tell a story about how they might come to begin to use language and how it might develop, and of course nature would come to its aid as babies will get better and better at doing this because they'll be selected for doing this. And then what I trace is a purely thought experiment about what effect on these creatures, the humanoids, human-like creatures, what difference the coming to speech would actually make in their lives. What I argue is that there's a whole range of capacities that the humanoids would develop as a result of coming to language, even if they didn't have them by nature independently of language, so that language has always fed into these capacities. The capacities I look at are the ability to make up our own minds, you know. You look at even Well, I would say I've got a clever dog. The mind makes up my dog's, the world makes up my dog's mind. It updates its information, you know, by noticing things, its mind changes, it takes different courses of action. I think we can help to make up our own minds as a result of learning to speak. That's a long story, and I'm sure we don't want to go into it here. But then I argue we also learn to reason, that, you know, you don't ever see a dog, except in cartoons, you know, thinking or, you know, trying to work out its own mind. But we reason like that. And I think language is what enables that. Equally, we hold one another responsible. You know, you could have done otherwise. We may get angry with the dog for soiling the carpet or whatever, but we don't really hold the dog responsible. I think all of these are really due to the shaping of our nature by language. And I think each of us as a child grows into humanity as we are raised by our parents and our community to master language, to internalize it, to develop those mental capacities that are actually the reflection of social or linguistic skills.
Also wir kommen als Menschen nicht nur zur Welt, sondern wir kommen eben auch zur Gemeinschaft, und erst dann werden wir wirklich Mensch, wenn ich Sie richtig verstehe. Und dieses Ideal des Menschseins, das versuchen Sie ja wirklich in all diesen Theorien immer wieder neu herauszuschälen, eben auch das Ideal des Menschen als ein freies Wesen, das nicht dominiert wird. Vielleicht zum Schluss, wie leben wir denn zusammen, auch ganz persönlich in Liebesverhältnissen zum Beispiel? Wie gelingt es, einerseits sich zu binden, zu lieben und andererseits nicht zu dominieren?
The theme really goes back to, I mean, to take your first remark, it used to be said, poets are born, not made. I think human beings are made, not born.
Sehr schön.
Now, Sartre, of course, had one reading about that. He felt that human beings made themselves. Each of us was self-made in the exercise of this existentialist freedom. I think that is too simple. I think that we're each, in the first place, made by our relationships as we mature from childhood into adolescence and adulthood, by our relations with other human beings. We learn words initially just in a rote way, like parrots really, and then we begin to own the words. You know, we use the words for our own purposes in speaking to our parents or whatever, and then we learn to be able to even use these words to ourselves, which speaking to ourselves, speaking in our heart, is a bit like thinking, and we internalize the social skills and become human in that sense. Now, of course, as we mature, though, we become aware in these relations with other people that we can be independent and be, as Sartre would say, our own masters, you know, be our own persons, insofar as we have a social world in which other people give us space, make room for us. And that's really what freedom as non-domination is. It means that the people around you do not have the position of masters in your life. We each have to have the same range of basic liberties or choices, and we each have to have the same protection, at least to the extent that we, this is ideally, of course, pass the eyeball test. We really can look at others in the eye without reason for fear or deference. And equally, we do that under a law where we don't have to live in fear or deference of government. However, once we have that power, we can then, of course, choose of our own will. We can choose to link with another person, to build a relationship with them. That's a relationship, say, of friendship or maybe of love. And I think what really is interesting is that we don't fall in love. We choose to love another person. And we can only, in a way, do that insofar as we have the power of saying no, should we wish. We're not forced into it. So the 18th century image of a woman, say a middle-class, upper-class woman, who basically had to get married, you know, for all of these wonderful sort of romantic novels of even Jane Austen, you know, and so on, I find it very hard to understand to really understand what those women are enjoying as a matter of love, because they've had no choice but to find a man and embrace that man. You know, so I think our relationships are very important, that we choose even our loving relationships.
Das klingt mir doch ein bisschen verkopft, weil ich denke, natürlich stimmt das für die Romane von Jane Austen, dass die Frauen oft keine Wahl hatten und heiraten mussten, um überhaupt das Vermögen zu haben. Aber sich zu verlieben, das fühlt sich doch manchmal schon so an, als wäre etwas größer als man selbst. Und das könnte man sich dem nicht einfach entziehen.
So let me really correct what I said. I do think, of course, we undergo emotions, you know, and affections, and this is something that happens to us with some other people. We enjoy that when we fall in love, and we rightly do fall in love in that sense, and we enjoy it when we meet people with whom we form spontaneous friendships. But we are free to endorse those feelings or to pull back from them, to resist them. And it's only insofar as we don't depend on, so to speak, going with the feelings, we don't depend for our very livelihood, you know, as in the case of the 18th century woman, I imagined, for going with those feelings. It's only when we have that freedom of authorizing, so to speak, endorsing these feelings. Yes, this is someone I love, I embrace, and of course, we do that only when it's reciprocal, at least ideally. But you can fall in love in that sense properly, it seems to me, only if you've got the power that goes with non-domination. Only if you really respect it, because the notion of respect is really almost equivalent to the notion of being a free person, being someone who passes the eyeball test.
Und in dieser Lücke, dass ich sozusagen mich zu meinen Gefühlen verhalten kann und dass ich noch Ja sagen kann, bejahen, was mich sozusagen zieht oder drängt, da gibt es ja auch noch den Begriff im Deutschen zumindest der Selbstbeherrschung. Also ist eigentlich der einzige Herrscher, den wir akzeptieren sollten, sind wir selbst.
Yes, ultimately, and that really gives me one thought that I should add and should make clearer early, really. And that is that the idea of non-domination, of not being, you know, is an ideal that's realized by our society insofar as the law really curtails other people. And other people embrace that law. They embrace the curtailment, the restrictions on their interfering with you. It's only in virtue of that negative condition that we can each be free citizens. But of course, you could be a free citizen, enjoy social freedom in that sense, but, for example, be very weak of will, you know, not enjoy that autonomy, not make use of that social power that your society has given you. And that's what's really important in the personal life, is not just to enjoy that social independence of others, that social non-domination by others, that social freedom, but to make something of that freedom in deciding with that social power, in deciding what you want to do, what you actually prioritize, and living up to those priorities. And we know all too well, of course, that that itself is a deep challenge, living up to those priorities, being the person that you want yourself to be.
Ich denke, wir haben in diesem Gespräch uns nicht gegenseitig dominiert, aber es dominiert uns etwas anderes, nämlich die Zeit. Deswegen sind wir leider am Ende unseres Gesprächs. Ich bedanke mich ganz herzlich, Philippe Petit, dass Sie Zeit gefunden haben für dieses Gespräch. Danke sehr.
It's been a wonderful pleasure to talk with you. Thank you very much.